The dry Arizona wind carried whispers of change as Kyle Jenson rode into town, his weathered face bearing the scars of a man who'd seen too much death and too little mercy. It was 1875, and Dillon was just another dusty mark on a map that stretched across a territory still wild enough to swallow men whole and spit out nothing but memories. The sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the rutted Main Street as Kyle guided his chestnut mare past the general store, the saloon, and the small church that seemed to stand as an afterthought to the town's more lucrative establishments. He hadn't planned to stay in Dillon longer than it took to resupply, and maybe enjoy a hot meal that hadn't been cooked over a campfire, but fate had other plans, as it often did for men like him. "Looks like rain coming," the livery stable owner commented as Kyle handed over the reins of his horse. "Might want to wait it out before heading on. Flash floods in these parts can be deadly this time of year." Kyle nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening sky to the west. "Appreciate the warning." The older man squinted at him. "You passing through or looking for work?" "Just passing through," Kyle answered, adjusting his worn leather saddlebags over his shoulder. "Any place in town serve a decent meal?" Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. 2 buildings down from the bank. Best food in 3 counties. Kyle tipped his hat in thanks and made his way down the street, the weight of his Colt revolver familiar against his hip. He'd been drifting for nearly 2 years now, ever since Gettysburg's memories had become too heavy to bear in one place. The war had been over for a decade, but some men carried battlefields within them long after the guns fell silent. Mrs. Whittaker's proved to be exactly as promised: clean, quiet, and serving food that reminded Kyle of home. He secured a room for the night just as the first raindrops began to fall, heavy and insistent against the windows. By morning, the storm had transformed into a deluge. Kyle stood on the covered porch watching sheets of water turn the main street into a muddy river. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. "Never seen it come down like this," said a voice beside him. Kyle turned to find a man in a sheriff's badge standing there, coffee cup in hand. "Sheriff Dan Miller," the man introduced himself. "You picked a hell of a day to be in Dillon." "Kyle Jenson," he replied with a nod. "Wasn't planning to stay, but the weather had other ideas." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "You look familiar. Rode with anyone I might know?" "Fifth Cavalry, Union Army, but that was a lifetime ago." The tension in the sheriff's shoulders eased slightly. "Confederate myself. 8th Texas." He paused. "War's over, though." "Has been for a while," Kyle agreed. Their conversation was interrupted by shouting from down the street. Through the curtain of rain, Kyle could make out a man on horseback riding hard into town, waving frantically. "Sheriff! Sheriff Miller," the rider was calling. "The river's breached its banks. The Henderson place is underwater and the bridge to Willow Creek is gone." The sheriff cursed under his breath. "Anybody hurt?" "Don't know, but the stage from Tucson was due through there this morning." Kyle didn't hesitate. "I'll ride with you." The sheriff gave him a quick, assessing look. "Can you handle yourself in a flood?" "Pulled half my company out of the Rappahannock in '63. 20 minutes later, Kyle found himself riding alongside Sheriff Miller and 4 other men from town, battling through the downpour toward the swollen river that carved through the valley east of Dillon. The rain had slackened somewhat, but the damage was already done. Water rushed across what had once been dry land, carrying debris and the occasional livestock carcass. They found the stagecoach 2 miles downstream from where the bridge had been. It lay on its side, half submerged in the still rising waters, the horses gone and no movement visible from within. "Anyone alive in there?" Sheriff Miller shouted, but the roar of the water swallowed his words. Kyle was already dismounting, tying his horse to a sturdy tree well away from the flood waters. "I'm going to check," he called, stripping off his coat and gun belt. "Too dangerous," one of the other men protested. "Current's too strong." But Kyle was already wading into the cold, churning water, using fallen trees and debris to steady himself as he worked his way toward the stagecoach. The rush of the current pulled at his legs, threatening to sweep him away with every step. When he reached the stagecoach, he could see that its door was underwater. Bracing himself against the frame, he took a deep breath and ducked under, feeling along the submerged side until his hands found the latch. It took 3 attempts before the door swung open against the pressure of the water. Inside, 2 women clung to the upper side of the compartment, their faces pale with fear and cold. One was younger, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair plastered to her face. The other appeared to be in her 30s, blonde and clutching a small leather case to her chest as though it contained all her worldly possessions. "Can you swim?" Kyle shouted over the roar of water. The dark-haired woman nodded, but the blonde shook her head, terror evident in her eyes. "Take my hand," Kyle instructed the younger woman. "When you're out, hold onto the coach. I'll come back for your friend." The dark-haired woman hesitated only briefly before reaching for his outstretched hand. Together, they navigated the rushing waters, Kyle using his body to shield her from the worst of the current. When they reached a point where she could stand, he left her clinging to a partially submerged tree and went back for the blonde woman. She was sobbing now, her knuckles white around the handle of her case. "You need to let that go," Kyle told her. "I can't," she replied, her voice trembling. "It's all I have left." Kyle didn't have time to argue. "Put your arms around my neck then. Don't let go no matter what happens." The journey back was twice as difficult. The woman's panic made her rigid, and the added weight of both her and the case she refused to abandon made fighting the current nearly impossible. Twice they were swept under, and Kyle thought they might not resurface. But somehow he managed to keep them moving toward shore, inch by painful inch. When they finally reached the shallows where the dark-haired woman waited, Kyle's strength was nearly spent. The other men from town waded out to help them the rest of the way to solid ground where they collapsed in exhaustion. "Thank you," the blonde woman gasped between chattering teeth. "You saved our lives." The dark-haired woman nodded earnestly. "How can we ever repay you?" Kyle shook his head, water streaming from his hat brim. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice rough with exertion. "Thank heaven for timing. If we'd been 10 minutes later, that coach would have been completely underwater." Sheriff Miller wrapped blankets around the shivering women. "What are your names, ladies?" Deanna Edwards, the dark-haired woman answered. "I was coming to Dillon to take the teaching position." "Abigail Thornton," said the blonde. I was on my way to Silver City." Kyle noticed how she clutched her case even tighter as she spoke, but he said nothing. Everyone had secrets, and hers were none of his business. He'd saved them both, and that would have to be enough. "The bridge is out," Sheriff Miller explained. "You'll both have to stay in Dillon until the waters recede and repairs can be made. Could be a week or more." Kyle knew he should leave as soon as the weather cleared, continue his journey to nowhere in particular. But as Deanna Edwards' dark eyes met his, something shifted inside him, something he thought had died long ago at Gettysburg. "You're bleeding," she said suddenly, pointing to a gash on his forearm he hadn't even noticed. Kyle looked down at the wound, surprised. "Must have caught it on something in the coach." "Let me see to that," she insisted, her teacher's authority already evident in her tone. "It's the least I can do." Back in Dillon, the town had mobilized to help flood victims. The 2 women were given rooms at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house, and Kyle found himself seated at the kitchen table while Deanna cleaned and bandaged his arm. "You have a gentle touch, Miss Edwards," he commented as she worked. "I've had practice," she replied with a small smile. "My father was a doctor in Boston. I was often his assistant before." She trailed off. "Before," Kyle prompted. Diana's expression clouded. "Before he died in the war, Confederate Field Hospital. He didn't believe in choosing sides when it came to saving lives." Kyle felt a weight in his chest. A good man, then. The best. She tied off the bandage and stepped back. "There. Keep it clean and it should heal nicely." Their eyes met again, and Kyle felt that same strange shift, like ground giving way beneath his feet. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to feel anything beyond the basic necessities of survival that the sensation was almost frightening. "Thank you," he said, standing abruptly. "I should check on my horse." Deanna nodded, but there was a flash of disappointment in her eyes. "Of course." "Will you be staying in Dillon long?" "Just until the weather clears," Kyle replied, already knowing it was a lie even as he spoke the words. Over the next few days, the rain continued intermittently, keeping the river high and the roads impassable. Kyle found himself drawn into the life of the small town, as they worked together to repair flood damage and help stranded travelers. And increasingly, he found himself in Deanna Edwards' company. She had taken over the schoolhouse temporarily to give the town's children somewhere to go while their parents dealt with the aftermath of the flood. Kyle discovered her there on the third day, attempting to replace broken windows by herself. "You'll cut yourself," he said from the doorway, making her start. Deanna turned, a pane of glass balanced precariously in her hands. "Mr. Jenson, you startled me." "Kyle," he corrected her, stepping forward to take the glass. "Let me help with that." They worked together throughout the afternoon, repairing windows, mopping floors, and righting overturned desks. Deanna spoke of her journey west, of her hopes to make a difference in the lives of frontier children who had few educational opportunities. "What brought you out here?" she asked as they sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sunset paint the still sodden landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "You don't strike me as a man who spent his life drifting." Kyle was silent for a long moment. "I had a farm in Pennsylvania, a wife. A son on the way when I left to fight." Diana's hand found his on the weathered wood of the step. "What happened?" "Gettysburg happened," Kyle said softly. "The battle came to our land. Mary, my wife, she tried to flee with the other women and children, but—" He couldn't finish. "I'm sorry," Deanna whispered. Kyle looked down at her hand on his, small and pale against his sun-darkened skin. "After the war, I couldn't stay there. Too many ghosts, so I've been moving ever since, taking work where I can find it. And looking for peace." He met her eyes, surprised by her perception. "Maybe. Haven't found it yet." "Perhaps you've been looking in the wrong places," Deanna suggested gently. Kyle didn't have an answer for that. Meanwhile, Abigail Thornton kept mostly to herself, emerging from her room at Mrs. Whitaker's only for meals. Kyle noticed the way her eyes darted nervously whenever anyone entered the dining room, the way she startled at sudden noises. A woman running from something, he decided. Or someone. His suspicions were confirmed on the 5th day after the flood, when 3 men rode into Dillon asking questions about a blonde woman traveling alone. They claimed to be U.S. Marshals, but Kyle had spent enough time around lawmen to recognize the falsehood in their manner. "Bounty hunters," Sheriff Miller confirmed in a low voice as they watched the men from the window of his office. "Question is, who are they hunting and why?" "The blonde from the stagecoach," Kyle said. "Abigail Thornton." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "Sure enough to keep an eye on her and them." That evening, Kyle knocked on Abigail's door at the boarding house. She opened it just a crack, her face pale and drawn. "They've found me," she whispered, not even asking who they were. "Not yet," Kyle replied, "but they're looking." "Want to tell me why?" Abigail hesitated, then opened the door wider to admit him. The leather case she'd clutched so desperately during the rescue lay open on her bed, revealing stacks of documents and what appeared to be ledgers. "My husband was Samuel Thornton," she began, her voice steadier than Kyle expected. "He owned mining operations in Colorado and Nevada. When he died 6 months ago, I discovered he'd been falsifying production reports to his investors for years. Swindling them," Kyle surmised. Abigail nodded. "I tried to make it right, to expose what he'd done. But his partners, they threatened me, said I'd hang alongside them if the truth came out, so I gathered what evidence I could and ran. And now they've sent men to silence you. Men who won't hesitate to kill me for these documents." She placed a protective hand on the ledgers. "I was taking them to a federal judge in Silver City who my father once knew. I thought he might help." Kyle considered the situation. "Those men will be watching the roads out of town once they realize you're here. And the river won't be crossable for days yet. What should I do?" There was a quiet desperation in her voice. "Hide those somewhere safe," Kyle instructed, nodding toward the documents. "Then come with me. I have an idea." Kyle's plan involved moving Abigail to the small back room of the schoolhouse, where Diana had agreed she could stay hidden while they figured out a more permanent solution. What Kyle hadn't anticipated was that bringing the two women together would forge a bond between them. "She needs more than just a hiding place," Diana told Kyle the next morning as they watched Abigail sleeping fitfully on a makeshift bed. "She needs a way to deliver those documents without getting herself killed." "The men watching for her expect a woman traveling alone," Kyle mused. "They wouldn't look twice at a married couple." Diana's eyes widened slightly. "Are you suggesting one of us should pretend to be her husband?" "No," Kyle said, his expression grave. "I'm suggesting we find a way to get those documents to Silver City without her having to go at all." For the next 2 days, they crafted a plan. Diana, with her respectable position as the town's new teacher, would travel to Silver City once the river subsided, ostensibly to purchase books for the school. Kyle would accompany her as protection. They would carry Abigail's documents hidden among Diana's teaching materials. What they hadn't counted on was the bounty hunter's impatience. On the evening before their planned departure, the three men cornered Mrs. Whittaker outside her boarding house, demanding information about Abigail. "They threatened to burn the place down if I didn't tell them where she'd gone," the shaken woman told Kyle and Sheriff Miller afterward. "I had to tell them something, so I said she'd left on the supply wagon to Tucson yesterday morning." "That should buy us some time," the sheriff said. "But not much. They'll figure out they've been misled soon enough." Kyle nodded grimly. "We need to move tonight." The river had receded enough that crossing was possible, though still dangerous. Under cover of darkness, Kyle, Deanna, and Sheriff Miller escorted Abigail to the edge of town, where they'd prepared a small rowboat. "The current will help you downriver," Sheriff Miller explained. "Stay close to the far bank and you should reach Willow Creek by dawn. I've sent word ahead there'll be horses waiting." Abigail clutched Deanna's hands. "I can never repay what you've done for me." "Bring those men to justice," Deanna replied. "That will be payment enough." Kyle helped the two women into the boat, then paused, looking at Deanna with a question in his eyes. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "We agreed." "It's more dangerous than we thought," he argued. "Those men won't hesitate to kill anyone helping her." All the more reason she shouldn't face this alone. Diana's expression was resolute. "Besides, two women traveling together will attract less attention than a lone woman with a man who isn't her husband." Kyle knew she was right, but the thought of Diana putting herself in danger caused a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "If anything happens to you, it won't," she assured him. "We'll deliver the documents and be back before you know it." He wanted to say more, to tell her how in just a few short days she had awakened something in him he'd thought was buried with his wife. Instead, he simply nodded and helped Sheriff Miller push the boat into the current. "I'll follow along the bank," Kyle called softly as the river began to carry them away. "If there's trouble, fire a shot in the air." Diana's face was just a pale oval in the moonlight as she nodded, then bent to the oars alongside Abigail. Kyle spent a restless night tracking the boat's progress from the shore, stopping only when dawn revealed a small settlement in the distance that he assumed was Willow Creek. He watched through his field glass as the boat reached the far shore, and the two women were met by figures he couldn't identify at this distance. Only when he saw them safely mount horses and ride out of sight did he allow himself to breathe easier. Turning his own horse back toward Dillon, Kyle tried to sort through the complicated emotions Deanna Edwards had stirred in him. He had spent so many years keeping people at a distance that the sudden intensity of his feelings for her was disorienting. Part of him wanted to ride away now, before she returned, before he could be hurt again. But a stronger part, a part he'd thought dead, wanted to stay, to see if what was growing between them might flourish. His deliberation was cut short by the sound of galloping hooves. Pulling his horse into the cover of a stand of cottonwoods, Kyle watched as the three bounty hunters rode hard along the river trail, headed in the direction the women had gone. "Damn," Kyle muttered, spurring his horse after them. The chase led him through rough country, the trail sometimes disappearing entirely as it wound through rocky outcroppings and dry arroyos. Kyle pushed his mount as hard as he dared on the treacherous terrain, grateful for the animal's sure-footedness. By mid-afternoon, he had closed much of the distance between himself and the bounty hunters, catching occasional glimpses of dust from their passing. As the sun began to set, he topped a rise and saw them in the valley below, not just the three men, but Diana and Abigail as well, their horses tethered to a small stand of trees. The women sat on the ground, their hands apparently bound, while the men conversed in a tight circle nearby. Kyle dismounted, tying his horse well back from the ridgeline, and crawled forward to get a better view. The situation was grim. The bounty hunters had positioned themselves with clear fields of fire, and there was little cover between Kyle's position and where the women were being held. A frontal assault would be suicide. As darkness fell, Kyle worked his way down the back side of the ridge, approaching the camp from the east where the shadows were deepest. He could hear voices now, carried on the night air. "Just tell us where the ledgers are and this can end easy," one of the men was saying. "No need for anyone to get hurt." "They're already on their way to Judge Parker," Abigail replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "There's nothing you can do to stop it now." The sound of a slap echoed through the darkness, followed by Diana's cry of outrage. "Leave her alone," Diana demanded. "She's telling the truth." Kyle froze, every instinct screaming at him to rush forward, consequences be damned. But years of combat had taught him the value of patience. He forced himself to remain still, watching as one of the men knelt beside Diana. "Maybe you know where these precious documents are, schoolteacher," the man suggested, his voice silky with menace. "Your friend here doesn't seem inclined to be helpful." "I know nothing," Diana insisted. "I was merely traveling with Mrs. Thornton for companionship." The man laughed. "Companionship, is it? Then you won't mind keeping her company a while longer." He stood, addressing his comrades. "Search their saddlebags again. The ledgers have to be here somewhere." As two of the men moved toward the horses, Kyle saw his opportunity. Moving silently through the underbrush, he positioned himself behind the largest tree near where Deanna and Abigail sat. The third man stood several yards away, rifle cradled in his arms as he watched his companion search. Kyle drew his knife and reached around the tree trunk, placing one hand over Deanna's mouth to prevent her from crying out in surprise. Her eyes widened as she felt the cold metal of the blade against the ropes binding her wrists. "When I move, run for the trees to the north," he whispered against her ear. "Take Abigail with you." Deanna nodded almost imperceptibly, and Kyle felt her relax slightly against his hand. He quickly cut through her bonds, then Abigail's, before melting back into the shadows. The guard shifted position, moving closer to where his companions were cursing over the empty saddlebags. Kyle circled behind him, then lunged forward, one arm locking around the man's throat while his other hand clamped over his mouth. The struggle was brief and silent. Kyle hadn't survived years of warfare without learning how to dispatch an enemy quickly. Lowering the unconscious man to the ground, Kyle drew his revolver and took careful aim at the oil lantern hanging from a tree branch near the other two bounty hunters. The shot shattered the night, followed immediately by the explosion of the lantern. Burning oil sprayed across the clearing, igniting dry grass and creating instant chaos. The two remaining bounty hunters dove for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. Kyle caught a glimpse of Deanna pulling Abigail into the trees to the north, just as they'd planned. He fired twice more to keep the bounty hunters pinned down, then retreated, circling wide to avoid their fire as he made his way toward where he'd told the women to hide. He found them crouched in a dry creek bed, Deanna with an arm around Abigail's shoulders. "Are you both all right?" Kyle asked urgently, kneeling beside them. Deanna nodded. "They didn't hurt us, just frightened us." "We need to move," Kyle said, helping them both to their feet. "My horse is back up on the ridge. It'll be a tight fit with three, but we can make it to the next town if we ride through the night." "What about the ledgers?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They're still in my boot." Kyle stared at her in surprise. "You had them on you the whole time. I couldn't risk them being found in the saddlebags," she explained. "And I knew if they searched me, well, most men have certain boundaries they won't cross with a lady." Despite the gravity of their situation, Kyle found himself smiling. "Mrs. Thornton, you are full of surprises." They moved through the darkness as quickly as stealth would allow, the sound of confused shouting from the bounty hunters fading behind them. When they reached Kyle's horse, he helped the women mount, then led the animal on foot, unwilling to burden it further with his weight over such difficult terrain. By dawn, they had put several miles between themselves and their pursuers, eventually reaching a small ranching outpost where they were able to purchase 2 more horses. From there, they rode hard for Silver City, arriving 2 days later, exhausted but unharmed. Judge William Parker proved to be everything Abigail had hoped: a man of integrity, who understood the significance of the documents she had risked so much to deliver. He immediately issued warrants for the arrests of Samuel Thornton's former partners and assigned federal marshals to escort Abigail back to Colorado, where she would testify against them. "What will you do afterward?" Deanna asked as they stood outside the judge's office, saying their goodbyes. Abigail smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Start over, I suppose. Samuel left debts, not fortunes, but at least I'll have a clear conscience." "You're welcome in Dillon anytime," Deanna told her. "We school teachers need to stick together." Abigail's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" "The way you helped those children at the mission yesterday," Deanna explained. "You have a teacher's patience." "I taught for 3 years before I married Samuel," Abigail admitted. "Perhaps it's time to return to it." Their goodbyes were emotional but brief. As Kyle and Deanna watched Abigail ride away with her martial escorts, Deanna slipped her hand into his. "Ready to go home?" she asked softly. Kyle looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, glowing with something that might have been hope. "Home," he repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I believe I am." The journey back to Dillon was considerably less eventful than their adventure to Silver City. They rode at a leisurely pace, taking time to talk in a way they hadn't been able to before. Deanna spoke of her life in Boston, of her decision to come west after losing both parents, of her belief that education could bridge the divides that had torn the nation apart during the war. Kyle, in turn, shared more about his life before Gettysburg, his childhood in Ohio, his marriage to Mary, his dreams of expanding the farm they'd started together. And gradually, he began to speak of the years since, of the emptiness that had driven him west, of the guilt he carried for surviving when so many hadn't. "You think you could ever settle in one place again?" Deanna asked one evening as they sat beside their campfire. Kyle gazed into the flames, considering. "I've been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay still." "Perhaps you just need the right reason to stop," she suggested. He looked up, meeting her eyes across the fire. "Perhaps I do." When they rode into Dillon a week after leaving, they found the town largely recovered from the flood. The bridge had been repaired, buildings mended, and life had resumed its normal rhythm. Sheriff Miller greeted them with news that the third bounty hunter, the one Kyle had left unconscious, had been captured trying to steal a horse from the livery stable. "Judge Parker's marshals came through yesterday and took him off our hands," the sheriff explained. "Said to tell you that Mrs. Thornton arrived safely in Denver to testify." "That's good news," Deanna said, relief evident in her voice. "Indeed it is," the sheriff agreed. "Now, Miss Edwards, the school board is mighty anxious for you to start teaching. Flood damage to the schoolhouse has been repaired, and they're hoping you can begin classes next Monday." Deanna glanced at Kyle, a question in her eyes. "I believe I might stay in Dillon a while longer," Kyle said, answering her unspoken query. "I hear the ranch outside town is looking for an experienced hand." Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Larson could use the help. His foreman quit last month." That evening, Kyle walked Deanna to Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, where her room awaited her return. They paused on the porch, reluctant to part after so many days in each other's company. "Will you really stay in Dillon?" Deanna asked, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. Kyle took her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt now. "I'd like to, if I have a reason." Deanna stepped closer, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. "I think you do." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the kiss of two people who had known loss and were cautious with newfound hope. When they drew apart, Kyle saw in Deanna's eyes the same wonder he felt. "Good night, Miss Edwards," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Deanna smiled. "Good night, Mr. Jenson. I'll see you tomorrow." The days that followed took on a pattern that gradually began to feel like a life rather than a temporary stop on an endless journey. Kyle took the job at the Larson Ranch, proving himself skilled not just with horses but with the complex work of managing a growing cattle operation. Deanna threw herself into establishing her school, quickly becoming beloved by her students and respected by their parents. They courted properly, under Mrs. Whittaker's watchful eye. Sunday dinners, walks after church, occasional rides into the countryside when Deanna wasn't busy with school preparations. Kyle found himself looking forward to these times together with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. Summer turned to fall, and as the leaves began to change color along the riverbanks, Kyle realized he was no longer thinking of moving on. For the first time since Gettysburg, he was making plans that extended beyond the next week or month, plans that increasingly included Deanna. One crisp October evening, he took her riding to a ridge overlooking the valley where Dillon nestled among the cottonwoods. The setting sun painted the landscape in rich golds and ambers, and in the distance, they could see the silver ribbon of the river that had brought them together. "It's hard to believe it's the same river that nearly killed Abigail and me," Deanna mused as they spread a blanket on the ground. "It looks so peaceful now." "Nature has many faces," Kyle replied, settling beside her. "Like people." Deanna turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed since that day, the day you pulled us from the river." "Have I? You smile more," she said simply. "You look forward instead of back." Kyle reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I have something to look forward to now." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box, worn with age but still beautiful, its brass hinges polished to a soft gleam. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Deanna whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Deanna Edwards, I never expected to find love again," Kyle said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "But you've shown me that the heart can heal, that there can be second chances." "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Diana's answer was a kiss that left no doubt of her feelings. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "Yes, Kyle Jenson. 1,000 times yes." They were married on Thanksgiving Day in the small church on Dillon's Main Street, with the whole town in attendance. Mrs. Whittaker cried openly, claiming credit for bringing them together under her roof. Sheriff Miller stood as Kyle's best man, while several of Deanna's female students served as her attendants, strewing late autumn flowers in her path. As winter settled over Arizona territory, Kyle and Deanna moved into a small house on the edge of town that they purchased with their combined savings. Close enough for Deanna to walk to the schoolhouse, yet with enough land for Kyle to keep a few horses of his own while still working at the Larson Ranch. Their first Christmas together was modest but joyful, their home decorated with pine boughs and candles, filled with the sense of Deanna's cooking and the sounds of friends who gathered to celebrate with them. As they lay in bed that night, listening to the winter wind outside their snug walls, Deanna nestled against Kyle's chest. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Kyle kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible again." In the spring, they received a letter from Abigail Thornton. The trials of her husband's former partners had concluded with convictions all around, and she had indeed returned to teaching, accepting a position at a girls' school in Denver. She wrote of her gratitude for their friendship and courage, and of her hope that one day she might visit them in Dillon. "We should invite her for the summer," Deanna suggested as they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset. "She could stay with us." Kyle smiled at his wife's generous spirit. "Of course, we have the room." Deanna's hand moved to rest on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "We might need that room sooner than you think." It took a moment for her meaning to register, and when it did, Kyle felt a surge of emotion so powerful he could barely speak. Joy, fear, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness all mingled together as he covered her hand with his own. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Deanna nodded, her eyes bright with happiness. "Dr. Matthews confirmed it yesterday. We'll have a child by autumn." Kyle gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. They sat together as twilight deepened into night, making plans and sharing dreams for their growing family. "I never thought I'd have this again," Kyle confessed in the darkness. A home, a family, a future worth fighting for. Neither did I, Deanna replied. After my parents died, I thought my life would be devoted to teaching other people's children. I never imagined having my own. Kyle thought about the strange path that had led him to this moment, the tragedy of war, the years of aimless wandering, the flood that had brought Deanna into his life. Thank heaven for timing, he murmured, echoing the words he'd spoken when he pulled her from the river. And thank heaven for a man brave enough to ride into a flood for two strangers, Deanna added, kissing him softly. Their son, James Miller Jenson, was born on a stormy September night, with rain lashing the windows in an echo of the flood that had brought his parents together. He had his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes, and from his first cry he held both their hearts in his tiny hands. Abigail Thornton arrived for a visit the following summer, bearing gifts for little James and news of her own engagement to a fellow teacher in Denver. The three friends spent long evenings on the porch, reminiscing about their harrowing adventure and marveling at how their lives had changed in such a short time. I never properly thanked you, Abigail said on her last evening in Dillon, as they sat watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Both of you risked everything to help a stranger. Your family now, Deanna told her, bouncing James on her knee. And family stands together. Kyle, watching his wife and son, felt a completeness he had thought forever beyond his reach after Gettysburg. The memories were still there, Mary, their unborn child, the farm in Pennsylvania, but they no longer haunted him with the same sharp pain. Instead, they had become a part of his story, honoring what was lost while embracing what had been found. As years passed, Dillon grew from a dusty outpost to a proper town, with a bank, a doctor's office, and eventually a small university where Deanna became head of the teachers' college. Kyle, having proven his worth at the Larson Ranch, eventually purchased land of his own, building a successful horse breeding operation that became known throughout the territory for the quality of its stock. James was joined by a sister, Mary Elizabeth, named for Kyle's first wife and Deanna's mother. Later came another son, Daniel, a spirited boy who combined his father's quiet strength with his mother's passion for learning. Their home, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, became a gathering place not just for their children but for the steady stream of young people drawn to Deanna's mentorship. In 1889, 14 years after that fateful flood, Abigail returned to Dillon for the dedication of the town's new bridge, a sturdy structure designed to withstand even the worst spring floods. The ceremony included the unveiling of a small plaque commemorating those who had been lost in the flood of '75 and honoring those who had risked their lives to save others. Kyle, now a respected community leader with silver threading his dark hair, stood uncomfortably as Sheriff Miller, now Mayor Miller, recounted the story of his bravery in rescuing the two women from the stagecoach. Deanna, still as lovely to Kyle as she had been on that rain-soaked day, squeezed his hand in understanding of his discomfort with public acclaim. We gather today not just to dedicate this bridge, Mayor Miller concluded, but to remember that it is in our darkest hours that our true character is revealed. Kyle Jenson didn't set out to be a hero that day, but when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. That's the spirit that built this town, and it's the spirit that will carry us into the next century. Later, as the celebration wound down and families began to drift homeward, Kyle found himself standing on the new bridge with Deanna, gazing down at the peaceful river below. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, leaning into his side. Kyle smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "About how one moment can change everything. If I hadn't been in town that day, if the storm had come a day earlier or later. If you hadn't been the kind of man who would ride into a flood for strangers, Deanna added. If you hadn't been worth riding into a flood for, he countered, kissing her temple. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset reflect on the water. Their children had gone ahead with Abigail to prepare dinner, giving them this rare moment of solitude. No regrets, Deanna asked softly, about staying in Dillon all these years. Kyle turned to face her fully, taking in the face that had become as essential to him as breath itself, the laugh lines around her eyes, the single streak of gray in her dark hair, the quiet confidence of a woman who knew herself and her place in the world. Not a single one, he assured her. Every day with you has been a gift I never expected to receive. Deanna smiled, the same smile that had first awakened his heart on a rain-swept porch 14 years earlier. Then let's go home, Kyle Jenson. Our family is waiting. Hand in hand, they walked off the bridge toward the lights of Dillon glowing warmly in the gathering dusk, a man who had found his peace, a woman who had found her purpose, and the life they had built together from the ruins of flood and war. Behind them, the river flowed on, ever-changing yet eternal, a reminder of the power of nature and the even greater power of love to transform lives in its unstoppable current.